Hey team, so yesterday or a few days ago in class we made a list of the characteristics of living things, and we found that all life has some common characteristics. They're made of cells, they're able to metabolize energy, they maintain homeostasis, they reproduce, they grow, etc., etc. I think we came up with a list of 7 or 8 things that all living things have in common. And because life shares so many common characteristics, it might not be surprising to you that all living things share a common ancestor. And these very simplified trees of life, or phylogenetic trees, is the fancy science way of saying a tree of life. We can look at evolutionary relationships of organisms to one another and determine how closely related they are. Okay, so today I'm going to teach you how to read the tree, and then we're going to talk about, we actually might not get to this yet. So basically, I'm just going to teach you how to read the tree today. And then you're going to keep this note because you're going to take notes on these 2 things later on. Okay, so this is a phylogenetic tree. It has a few different points that are important. If we go back, far enough back, if this is a tree showing us all living organisms on Earth, if we go far enough back, we get back to the origin of all life. All living things come from other living things, but then where did the first living thing come from? We're going to answer that question later on in the year, but not today. Okay, so this point, the furthest point back in our tree, represents the origin of life, or the root of our tree. And as we move up the tree in this direction, we move forward in time. So anything that is back here on the tree or here is something that's happened in the past, and then anything that is up at this end of the tree is the present day. So all of these organisms, organism A, B, C, D, and E, they're all alive today. Okay, any branching point that we see on the tree. So for example, here is a branching point. This represents a speciation event. So this means that before this branch point, we had one species. So if we were to look at the point right before the speciation event, right here at the crook of the point, this little point right here, this is the last shared common ancestor. So basically that means that A, B, C, and D shared a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, and that grandparent was right here. And then they went off in different directions. So maybe A and B, if you were to make an analogy to a family tree, A and B are siblings, and C and D are siblings, and if you traced back to their last shared common ancestors, you would find their grandparents right here. Okay, so A, B, C, and D, and E, these all represent unique species. So I'm not going to circle all of them. That was a horrible circle. So notability trick, if you make a circle and then hold it down, it should automatically turn it into a nice circle for you. And then if you use your lasso tool, you can click on it, make it bigger or smaller. There you go. Fun notability tricks. Okay, so these are all unique species. Okay, so we can use this tree to determine evolutionary relationships between all of these different organisms. So A and B are very closely related to one another, and C and D are very closely related to each other. And C and D are more closely related to A and B than they are to E. So because if you look back at their last shared common ancestor, C and D shared a more recent common ancestor with A and B than they did with E. Their last shared common ancestor between all of these four with E is all the way back here in time. Okay, so that's how you read a basic phylogenetic tree. If you're looking at a tree where this axis is time here, no organism should be further along the tree than any other because we've all been evolving for the same amount of time if we have a shared origin of life. However, we're going to examine a few more trees that are a little bit more complicated and they don't quite give us an accurate representation of time on the axis because they're depicted in slightly different ways. Okay, here is another tree. And yeah, I think I'm going to talk about this tree as well. Okay. So this is another depiction of our tree of life. Here, down in this little droplet of water, I don't really know why they show it as a droplet of water. This is our origin of life. And out of our origin of life, we see all other living things emerge. All these lines represent species and their branch points. Now, we have two broad groups within our tree here. One broad group is called, I'm going to change this color. Oops. This grouping within our tree are the prokaryotes. Prokaryotic organisms are organisms that lack a nucleus. And then our other big classification of organisms are eukaryotic organisms. So everything that's in this area of the tree is eukaryotic. This is a TIC here. Okay. Eukaryotic organisms have a nucleus. So I guess I should write those two things down. Prokaryotic organisms, no nucleus. And prokaryotic organisms have a nucleus. Okay, there are two broad groups of prokaryotic organisms. One you're probably familiar with. They are the bacteria. So this little group of cells here represents bacteria. It's not really a cell. These little lines represent bacteria. And this group of lines represents another group of prokaryotes called archaea. Or archaea. People say it both ways. Okay. The figure, I like this figure for some reasons because it shows evolutionary relationships kind of nicely. But I don't like it for other reasons because it leaves you to believe because these lines are shorter than the lines up here, that somehow archaea and bacteria stopped evolving at a certain point. And that's just not true. If this graphic were more accurate, all of the lines of archaea and bacteria and animals, they would all be the same length, the same distance from the origin of life. The one thing I do like about it is it shows us some important evolutionary relationships between bacteria and archaea and eukaryotic organisms. Notice that there's a line here coming from bacteria. So here's a line, a group of bacteria merged with a group of ancient archaea right here. And this kind of looks like, I don't know, a weird spongy thing. This represents a an event that we call the endosymbiotic event. In which an ancient archaea engulfed an ancient bacteria. Instead of eating it, they began to live together. And the bacteria that was eaten by the archaea became the modern-day mitochondria. So all eukaryotic organisms, all organisms that have a nucleus, and all organisms that are multicellular as well, represent organisms that arose out of just this one cell, this ancient archaea, that ancient bacteria that gave rise to all eukaryotic living things. So we are somewhere up here, humans, maybe over here, are more closely related to fungi and plants than we are to bacteria, for example. Okay, so within these groups of eukaryotic organisms, we have a couple different groupings, and one is the plants. So all these guys represent plants. The grouping over here represents all animals. I guess I should say the Latin names too. Plant, T-A-E, plantae. This is Animalia. And our last grouping is our fungi. Ah, wait, that's too small. Our last grouping are fungi, right here.
Hello.
Hi, Virginia. I'm recording a screencast. You want to say hi to Bio?
Hello, Bio.
Okay, these are the fungi. There's one more group on here. We have a another kingdom. So we have two domains of life. The two domains are prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic organisms. And then within that, we have a couple different kingdoms of life. So bacteria, archaea, plants, animalia, fungi. And then the last group is called the protista. And I'm going to circle some random areas of the chart because protists are actually a false phylogenetic grouping. Protista. We define protista as single cell or colonial organisms, not multicellular, that are eukaryotic. So fungi, animals, and plants are all multicellular organisms, and protists are kind of the junk drawer. They're all single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic, that are not multicellular. They're not fungi, animals, or plants. So some protists are actually more closely related to animals than they are to other protists, or they're more closely related to plants than they are to other protists. So it's a grouping that predates genetic sequencing, where we're able to look at DNA sequences and see how closely organisms are related to one another, and it was a grouping that was created when we were just looking at things underneath the microscope and putting them into groups that way. So it's a false grouping. Okay, there are things that I like about this graph. It shows you nicely the relationships between plants, animals, fungi, and archaea and bacteria, this endosymbiotic event, but it leads you to believe that animals maybe are the most important and have been evolving for the longest amount of time, and that's not true. All these things have evolving for an equal amount of time because we all share a common origin of life. Okay, that's all.